given the right to have this kind of, some kind of compact in which they can sort of step back and see those debates in their totality.
Mm-hmm.
Is that where the reader steps in? And is that how they kind of contribute to the imagining of these communities? Because I'm not quite sure that the reader has that full access, for reasons that I'll maybe come to after.
Yeah, I think that it's often a real sleight of hand. And I mean, I became conscious of that when I disabled or kind of discredited my own authority after gaining all that street cred about Brooklyn. I wrote an LA book, which was a deliberate affront to the idea of personal authority over place. And and I realized what a piece of absurd enchantment that authority is to begin with. Because I wrote You Don't Love Me Yet with I bought a really good large street map of Silver Lake, and I sat with it over my writing desk in Maine, and I would just pick street names in the book. And I did this one little scouting trip where I just went. I mean, for a couple of weeks I went and I sat in a couple of coffee shops in the neighborhood, and then I had my characters sit in those coffee shops. Well, this was, in a way, nothing more than what I did in motherless Brooklyn. I named the streets where I grew up, and I named some of the shops. And, but this really rather sketchy container is, into that is poured this enormous reservoir of credibility and kind of investment and projection. And so my readers who knew I'd grown up in Brooklyn and who were reading secondary sources that were celebrating the kind of investment that the book had in this kind of local texture, all felt it by the wave of the hand. And then with You Don't Love Me Yet, because I went around saying, oh, I've never lived in Los Angeles, people got really angry at me. Except when they didn't hear that I'd said that in some interview, and they would come up to me and say, oh God, you got Silver Lake so right. It's exactly what it was like for me and my friends, and they would pour all this credibility in my direction.
Right.
And it was just the same street names. It was nothing more, really.
Yeah.
So, this is where, of course, the fiction thrives, is on inviting the reader's projections into all sorts of, I was never happier. I mean, it was very nice when people would say that something like, that they were my age, and that they also snuck into CBGBs when they were 15, and that Fortress of Solitude got it so right. But some other times I would have someone from Glasgow say to me, I don't know why, but that's about my childhood, and then I would know that the book was working, right?
Yeah.
Because it was actually the place names didn't matter in the least.
Yeah.
There's something about just the nature of being a kid in school in a city that was kind of a wrecked city was much, much bigger than my particular experience.
Yeah. I suppose the problem I have with that idea of this kind of reader-writer compact also is...
You're one.
Was that?
Yeah, you're exploring it, but you're also one. You're also pouring stuff in.
Exactly. You're also pouring stuff in. And everyone else has. Yeah. All the people who read that book previously. Yeah. So there's a kind of constellated community that's already there that you can only imagine anyway. You can only imagine other people's inputs into that process.
Yeah, great.
Shall we invite some questions?
Take questions, probably, yeah. That we're at that point. And I think it'd be great.
Yeah, thanks.
But you keep throwing in if you hear something.
Absolutely, I will. Absolutely.
If you will.
Okay. Oh,
hey.
Well, I guess just to trail off of what you had just been talking about, with describing Silver Lake and everything like that, and about how that sense of familiarity that the reader can get from it gives them, I guess, a doorway into your novels. How, if location functions kind of similarly to genre, in that sense, and that it provides a framework for the reader to understand what you're talking about.
Great, yeah.
Do you have any desire as an author to rupture a sense of place, like you do a sense of genre?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think I was only ever, my relation to place as a writer is something that developed in a very strange way. I wrote about totally dislocated or kind of fictional spaces early on. I was away from where I grew up, away from New York City, living in the Bay Area, uninterested, I thought, in writing about New York, except maybe as a very sublimated metaphorical experience. And what I did was create these sort of fake versions of the West, based, even though I was living in the Bay Area, they were based as much still on like the background in Roadrunner cartoons or Hollywood movies, or the idea of virtual reality, which was at that moment being conjured up right near me in Silicon Valley, as they were on any ground level sense of bodies living in cities. I mean, I technically, one of those first 3 novels is set in Oakland. It names it as Oakland. San Francisco doesn't exist in the book. No one ever mentions or crosses the bridge. Another book, kind of technically takes place in like Wyoming, and then sort of a melted down cartoon Bay Area. And a third takes place in a fictional California city I made up, a college town called Beauchamp, and which was really as much Bennington College in Vermont as it was, because I wasn't in college in California. So I was really avoiding any kind of engagement with that real textural evocation of place. Now, nevertheless, it crept in funny ways, and some people who wrote about kind of occasional music wrote about, celebrated it as an East Bay novel. They were like, it's so Oakland, and I guess, I put the Claremont Hotel in the story, so it was an Oakland book, right? It sort of had to be somewhere.
With a kangaroo.
Yeah.
Very Oakland.
And then I wrote a couple of short stories in the period just following those first 3, I wrote those 3 novels very quickly. I was young. And then I wrote these short stories that were sort of troublesome ones for me, but important ones, where I wrote about New York City, although I was very far away from it. There was one called Light and the Sufferer, where the characters are on this sort of drug-buying spree all around the Upper West Side. And I mean, that one most importantly showed me that I seem to want to think about New York. And then I wrote one that didn't really have didn't announce where it was based, called The Hardened Criminals. But the beginning of it is deeply urban, and there are graffiti writers in it, spray painting on abandoned buildings. So it was like a tiny little glimmer of Fortress of Solitude coming. And then I realized I wanted to move back to New York, and I got there, and I had this total Valentine. I mean, Motherless Brooklyn is the only uncomplicated book about place that I probably could ever write or will ever write, because it was like I was just throwing my arms around it as I recaptured it in my life and captured it for the first time as a subject. A subject I actually told myself was never going to be available to me. It was too problematic. And I was like, what's problematic? I love this place. I'm from here. And I just wrote this love letter. Well, the immediate, the bill came due, and the bill was, you lied. You're tormented about this place. And that was Fortress of Solitude. And I had to break it and throw it into all sorts of disarray and make my character reject it as I had, and do 100 different things to, in a way, renounce the Valentine I'd just written. And that was the truth, not the lie.
I suppose the problem is also with place, I think it has this, the more specific you get about it, the more there can be a tendency for people to forget that it's fiction. So you end up with a situation where people are trying to retrace Daniel Quinn's steps around New York from the New York trilogy, or they're following Mrs. Dalloway around London, which still happens, And I don't know what liberties Virginia Woolf took with that. There'll be people here who know more than me about that. But there is that odd kind of, as soon as you appear to place it concretely, it has to be true.
Well, in fact, I put certain kinds of truth into both of those Brooklyn books, and that was different than anything I'd troubled over before. By the time of Fortress, I was doing a certain kind of degree of, a little bit of historical research, but even more importantly, kind of oral lore. I was going and making people I'd grown up with tell me about bits of the neighborhood that I hadn't understood, and making myself look harder at things that I remembered. And I mean, you know, and I did feel that I incurred, at the beginning I joked that you have to avoid responsibility. Totally. Well, I incurred responsibility towards some of these legacies, and it enriched the book quite a lot. Not in a way that I always want to be bound by, but for that project it was a gift that there was so much real meaning for so many people, and I could draw on it and enlist those feelings into the book. More questions?
I think not necessarily in relationships, it's sort of comments about craft. And he started, we started the conversation when he first started talking about community. It felt a lot like a kind of theory of the novel, kind of discourse, a theory of the contemporary novel in relationship to its earlier iterations. And you know, it's a very simple way of sort of charting that trajectory. And I think the way you kind of, at least on some level, kind of buying into is that, you know, the novel used to be about, rise of bourgeois individualism or something like that, right? And then and now in the contemporary moment, it turns more towards this notion of community, right? So I want to put a little pressure on this term community, because I want to think. I mean, I guess what I'm curious about is it an obfuscation or a synthesis, right? Is it a way of thinking about the relationship between the individual and the system, or is it a way of sort of not talking about nation, not talking about the state?
Stupendous. I think that's really great.
Yeah.
That's really great. Joe, this you just encapsulated a very, very difficult lesson I learned about my subject matter when I wrote Fortress of Solitude specifically. And it's been hard for me to explain to people the degree to which I am persuaded of this, which is that I went into the book thinking, let me back up and talk about really pure experience, and this is where my experience personally and the dilemma of the main character in that book are as one. So I won't sort of fudge it. My parents were anti-gentrificationists, even though we were a white family in a black and Hispanic neighborhood. They were hippies and they were leftists and they were deeply committed in all sorts of ideological and substantial ways to the idea that the neighborhood should be visible and celebrated and enriched on the terms that they'd come and found it, even though it was really a very, very difficult place for everyone who was living in it to live. And that there was another viewpoint that was also extremely legible. There were the renovators. These were white families who'd come explicitly hoping to bring more people like them to gradually, crucially renovate and clean up and displace. And they were unabashed about it. And this was a political argument, I thought, taking place within the space of a very small boundary, a community, right? About basically 12 city blocks that had been declared Borum Hill. And in Borum Hill, you had the renovators versus the anti-gentrificationists. The reason I give them that name is that the renovators would never use the word gentrification, but the anti-gentrificationists would, right? And I felt that I was from one side of this, but that growing up in it, I'd been in a very complicated bad faith as a child, because a part of me loved to see these beautiful brownstones made beautiful and clean and new, and especially vacant ones cleaned up. And I also liked feeling safer because I felt very empowered as a child. So I was fucked up. I believed one thing, but I felt another. And I wrote the book in this perplexity of thinking that I was a secret agent, a secret force for evil in a meaningful political dialogue. And by the time I finished the book, I came to feel that thinking about gentrification at all, in terms of a small community, in terms of neighborhood, 12 city blocks, was a way of not thinking about real power, real economics, real racism, real issues. It was a way of making it a tinker-toy battle of neighbor versus neighbor. I'm more honorable than you are. Instead of accepting that the only thing that was real was either much bigger than Boerum Hill or much smaller. And in other words, you could fight against economic injustice and racism in the USA as a whole. That would be a meaningful battle. Or you could do what my parents, I'm proud to say, did, which is care individually for their individual neighbors. For instance, rent out the apartment in our house cheaply to people who could barely afford even that rent, as opposed to jacking prices up because the neighborhood was gaining in glamour. Or being a good neighbor to all sorts of different kinds of people. That the intimate gesture, person to person, was meaningful, and fighting against economic injustice was meaningful. But the in-between size gesture, the community size gesture of trying to keep Boerum Hill from gentrifying was empty. It didn't amount to anything. It wasn't a great battle.
I mean, I think that's it. That's particularly why I'm interested in that kind of where the word community gets used, as a kind of obfuscation. Where the romantic view is kind of community comes before capital, which is clearly nonsense. The other argument is the whole sort of investment and fetishization of the idea of neighbourhood is actually trying to disguise the fact that neighbourhood can also be seen as the kind of spatial manifestation of flexible specialisation. It's kind of, the smaller you get, actually, the more kind of specialised your view of neighbourhood and block.
Yeah.
It's actually participating in much bigger...
It's like a bulwark against acknowledging these
Yeah.
larger forces that everyone's prey to. And, so like what if my parents had somehow perversely triumphed, right? So in the middle of the racist, economically unjust transformation of New York City, those 12 blocks had been kept mixed longer. What would it have meant, right? Zero. It was the larger issues that mattered in any real way.
I guess just as one final thought, I don't mean this in relationship to your work at all, but just back actually kind of to the more kind of deep time, long view, thinking about the novel and how the contemporary novel operates. I wonder if, one way to pose that same question is, does the contemporary novel deal honestly with system, or is it self-congratulatory? Is it really this kind of dramatic change? Or is it,
Right, of course.
And again, I don't expect you to answer that.
And the answer is probably both, and even in the space of certain novels, right? Sometimes honestly, and sometimes with self-aggrandizing patents. I'm sure that's the case.
Yeah.
I'll just kind of widen this framework very slightly because I'm excited by your remarks. I often see these things, and I'm very prone to this right now because I've been writing about histories, mid-century histories, things that begin the way people were feeling about themselves in the 1930s and 40s and 50s and 60s, and I'm more and more prone to seeing the massiveness of the trauma of each of the two world wars as so defining of consciousness, just per se, artistic consciousness, moral consciousness, etc., in a way that is denied or falsely concluded. So for instance, when I think about the hard-boiled detective novel, now I tend to think about the trench coat, which is a trench coat because he was in trench warfare. And the reason he's an injured figure before the novel begins, the reason he's already cynical, the reason he's already incapable of love, the reason he's already trying to protect people but doesn't feel he personally can be redeemed, is that he's a shell-shocked veteran. That's a novel, a genre that's secretly about war. And I guess I see a lot of the, as I've been thinking a lot about World War II, I've been moving that same kind of framework into the half of a century that I grew up inside, where we were saying that our story was about, personal liberations and Vietnam, or protesting nuclear power, or the invasion of El Salvador. But we were still all so enmeshed in the residue of the sensations, moral, aesthetic, conceptual acceptance of what World War II had been and what it meant. And it was still had so much sway over life. And I would also say this is true of the novel. So when I think about this matter of the novel, I go back to George Orwell writing about Henry Miller. Do you know that essay, Inside the Whale? Basically, I mean, he overrates Tropic of Cancer, but he does it in a very, very meaningful way. He basically says, this guy has reclaimed the intimate by being so selfish, so sexual, so, uninterested in global affairs. He's reclaimed the power of literature against the destruction that the century has offered to the artistic viewpoint. And, he saw Henry Miller's claiming in one stroke something that had been torn away from all novelists, which was the freedom to be self-absorbed. And so he was writing about war. He was writing about the global, not global capitalism, but global consciousness which came with the world wars, as intruding in a definitive way on the fundamental gesture of the novelist. So he awarded, Miller. He was like, Miller, you single-handedly rescued the novel by being uninterested. You're in Paris. It doesn't matter. You don't care. You just want to get laid. And for Orwell, it was like, of course, he was writing about himself. He was writing about his incapacity to imagine any kind of novel except 1984 at that point. A total political response to global consciousness. Maybe that,
I think, I've got too much to say really, but
yeah.
There are so many strands of criticism at the moment saying that we have this post-humanism, a return to feeling. It's the famous James Wood review, tell me how it feels, and tell me how does it feel, which is all about, we need to get back to human emotion, not this kind of cold postmodern. But the truth is, of course, it's an amalgamation of so many things. Then you've got the neurological novel, which is kind of very much about us as embodied biological beings, but it can also be seen as a metaphor for huge global systems. So the two things are always it comes back to your point, isn't it, about being sort of having this kind of internal state of trappedness, but also participating in these, all these different kind of communities. So I think it's a totally sitting on the fence kind of answer, I'm afraid. But that's...
I don't know, one or two more questions, I guess, and we could quit. Hey, Joe.
Hey, so I was hoping we could focus in for a minute on, I guess, one of the more intimate forms of gentrification, which I guess we could call hospitality. I've noticed that, so in Chronic City, for example, we have Chase and Stedman spending a whole lot of time in Perkis Tooth's house. We have the orphanage in Motherless Brooklyn. I would be interested in hearing about the way you think that a particular home rather than a community might be able to open itself up, and how I guess how the most intimate spaces function in the relation, the face-to-face relation between two people or a family.
That's really neat, Joey. And you've invited me to go ahead and answer it sort of in terms of just to try to respond to it, because I'm not sure I have a comprehensive answer. But just to respond to your really interesting question in terms of some of my own experiences and how they migrated into my fiction. I mean, I write about constructed homes. Even as I was saying, I think about identities as a series of auditions or frameworks that are modular. I think I see the home as itself a kind of a tenuous construction, terrifically important, and always being enacted, not taken for granted. And this has to do with personal history and with my idealization of the idea of the commune, which I sort of got to live through as a child, but even more, I was witness to other people living communally and navigating that sort of thing. It's one reason that I'm so attracted to academia, actually, is that it seems like a version of home. The self-governance of the English department is like it's like the meeting at a commune where you decide who's going to do dinner on what night. And
it has the same element of dysfunction. Yeah.
But so home is it's infinitely precious, obviously, and we're all animals looking for a home, right? It's a it involves deep desires. But I guess even as disastrous as it might seem to say about something that we desire so deeply and try to preserve as a kind of, with a kind of image of permanence, I see it as tenuous and negotiated. But that negotiation is itself a sustaining experience to undertake. Does that make sense?
There's
Thank you.
a sociologist in Brooklyn, Jerome Kreitz, has been quite influential on the stuff that I'm doing. He talks about, I mean, it's similar to Benedict Anderson. He's talking about community, it's never something concrete, or it's a series of symbolic cues. And his interesting take on architecture is that architecture is symbolic cues just as much, even though it's made of material. The way it functions in our imagining of our communities is symbolic in the same way as a novel or a piece of art or a street sign or whatever. So that's quite an interesting view of not so much home but the house, as just another kind of symbolic cue to an imagined understanding of community. And the fact you get in a particular area houses that look more or less the same is part of that kind of symbolisation that is undertaken.
That's a tempting place to stop, maybe, unless there's someone championing it. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you. Yeah.